Hi, my name's Cara Munro. I would love to welcome you to the first narrated PowerPoint we have for week one of Foundation Skills, Introduction to Effective Communication for AOD Workers. Being that this is a narrated PowerPoint, it means you can pause it at any stage, you can go and get a break. It's totally self-directed, so I'll absolutely leave it to you to interact with this presentation in whatever way is most meaningful to you. We're going to start out. I know this slide looks like it has a lot of words on it, which is an irony for a slide that is about communication. But today we're going to be exploring some of the essential elements of effective communication, and the second half of this presentation is going to be a little bit more of a dive into barriers to communication that are commonly experienced by AOD workers. But before we get into the experience of AOD workers, just acknowledging that communication is something that we all do all the time. We're social beings, we need one another. And if we jump down to the dot points at the second half of the screen, these are about why we communicate. What does communication achieve? What motivates us to communicate? And as I read through, have a think about the role of a drug and alcohol worker in relationship to their client, and see how relevant you think these might be. So the ability to communicate effectively shapes one's ability to express personal needs and understand the need of others, influence the attitudes and behaviour of others, form contacts and maintain relationships, make sense of the world and share our experiences in it with others, and finally, and this is a big one, give and receive emotional support. This definition of interpersonal communication is taken from a resource called the Youth AOD Toolbox. There's a link at the bottom of the screen. I highly recommend when you have the chance going through that resource. It's a vast encyclopedia of information for Victorian youth drug and alcohol workers about all the different skills that skills and knowledge that youth drug and alcohol workers need to practice really effectively. So there's a bit of a link there. Check it out. This next slide, explicit and implicit communication. And now these two terms might seem like we're jumping straight into something, a bit strange or a bit theoretical. But so much of this unit is going to be about really unpacking and really exploring this concept. So explicit and implicit communication. You'll all know about this and have experienced this and have experienced when this has gone wrong for you. But what it basically means is explicit communication is when you state something and the person who's receiving the message just understands exactly what is said or what is written and takes it at face value. Implicit communication is sometimes called reading between the lines, and it's the things that aren't said but that are understood. I've got a really interesting example of this I have so many interesting examples, but one that you'll all be familiar with is when you see someone, you see a friend, and you say, "Hi, how are you going?" And they say, I'm good, how are you?" And you know immediately from not what they've said, but from the way they've said it, whether they are actually good or not. So the explicit communication is, yes, I'm good, and you can take that as face value and say, oh, they're happy and, oh, good, walk away. But often the manner in which they say it might reveal that actually they're not very good at all, or they say it, with a bit of a shrug of their shoulders and looking down, and you get the impression that actually they are the opposite of good. So what you're picking up on there is the implicit communication. It's what is not being said, yet is being communicated very clearly. Now, some cultures in the world use more of the implicit style of communication than explicit. Some cultures, are more frank, and they state what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and you can take more of it at face value. So that's fine if you're communicating with someone from your cultural background. You'll have the same understanding of what's explicit, what's implicit, and when a person is speaking, you'll have more of a chance of actually getting to the heart of what's being said. However, Australia is a fantastic multicultural country. We've got people of so many different cultures, nationalities, and language groups all, sharing this space together. So, what we run into often, and especially in health services and as drug and alcohol workers, is mismatches in communication, because what someone may be saying explicitly and what they may be implying, two different things, and we can have a real breakdown in understanding of what's going on, and it can be really confusing. It can be really upsetting. And it can cause people to really even lose faith in a health service if they feel that they communicated something really, really, really clearly, but the AD worker just didn't get it. It can cause people to lose a sense of faith and feel discouraged and feel like, maybe I'm not actually going to get the help and support that I need here. So explicit and implicit communication, something to really think about in your practice. So we all communicate on a daily basis. We all also run into barriers in communicating. This unit's going to focus especially on communication that AOD professionals are engaged in. So we're going to narrow it down a little bit, and we're going to be looking at professional communication and therapeutic communication in particular. So before we do that, let's look at personal communication, which is different to therapeutic and professional, and it's something that we all engage with all the time. We communicate as ourselves with our friends and our family, and actually don't even think about it. We just do it quite naturally and quite intuitively. However, there are actually rules. There are expectations. We modify the way that we communicate depending on which family member or which friend we're communicating with, and also depending on the contexts. So I've got here an example of, I'm sure all of you have had the experience of speaking to an elderly member of your family. And I don't know about you, but I certainly, for one, speak a bit more slowly and loudly, because often older people, their hearing might be going a little bit. I also tend to modify my speech, so I don't swear in front of elderly people, or tend not to. And I might modify the sort of things I talk about. So the things that I talk about with my dear girlfriends might be different to the things that I would chat about with, an older member of my family. So we do actually make modifications. We're still ourselves, we're still authentic, but we do adjust, keeping in mind the person we're communicating with, what their experience of the world is, what their values, what their cultural norms are, and what their communication needs are as well. So it's definitely possible to still be authentic, to still be ourselves and be genuine, but just bring a mindfulness. And we do that within our personal communication all the time. I'm going to go into two types of communication that I mentioned before that are really pertinent to AOD workers. One is therapeutic communication and the other professional communication. So any of you who are already in the workforce will already be engaged in professional communication. It's a style of communication where you're still yourself. You're still as with personal communication, you're still your authentic self, your unique you. However, you might modify your language. So in the same way that I would modify my swearing around an older person, in a professional context, you might modify the choice of language. You might modify the way that you speak. When you're communicating professionally, you're actually representing the organisation or the sector or the profession that you're associated with. So you're not just speaking as yourself, you're also speaking as an AOD worker, and perhaps you're speaking as an AOD worker who belongs to a particular organisation that espouses particular values. So there's an expectation that if you're being employed to work with that organisation, even though sometimes you may have some personal values and beliefs that are not exactly aligned with what the organisation does, there is an expectation that part of your professional conduct is that you don't outwardly really blatantly express your personal views, that you withhold them somewhat and you agree to communicate the views and beliefs of the organisation that you're working for. This isn't always easy. This can be tricky, and in our class discussion we can go into some examples of navigating that trickiness. There are rules and expectations, just as there are social rules and etiquette when we communicate personally. Organisations have rules and expectations for staff conduct and the way we communicate, and often these rules and expectations are actually based on law. So there are laws about what you can and can't say and who you can share information with. There's confidentiality and privacy laws. There's copyright laws. There's freedom of speech laws. And so what organisations and services will do is they'll take relevant laws that are important for their staff to abide by, and then they create policy and procedure documents, which are the instruction manuals or the rules that that particular organisation has to ensure that their employees are following the laws and also following the organisation's expectations. And they speak specifically to the work context that that most of their employees are engaged in. So they're incredibly helpful documents, provided they're up to date and provided they've been written in such a way that actually speaks meaningfully to the types of communication dilemmas that employees are likely to be experiencing. Very occasionally there are policy and procedure documents that they're out of date, or they're just they just miss the mark in terms of they don't really provide helpful guidance for the situation that you're actually finding yourself in. And in those instances, they need to be updated. And until then, you can always speak to your manager, your team leader, get the advice and support of more senior colleagues as to how to navigate the particular situation or communication dilemma that you're in. And we're going to go into that more later on in the unit, and also in your legal and ethical unit, you'll be engaging with a lot more information about that. It's very interesting, and yeah, I love that sort of stuff. Now, therapeutic communication. This in itself is another type of communication, and it applies not just to drug and alcohol workers, but all health professionals. So psychologists, doctors, I'm a nurse, arts therapist, I'm also an arts therapist. We all engage in therapeutic communication. And basically, personal communication, the purpose of that could be we communicate with our friends and family for fun, just for enjoyment, to have a beautiful experience together. We might communicate to develop closeness, to create meaningful memories together. These are some of the motivations for communicating in a personal manner. Therapeutic communication has a very specific purpose, and that is that you're communicating therapeutically in order to support the client to improve their physical health, their mental health, their emotional well-being. Okay, so it's not about you. It's not about you having fun. You might have fun while you're communicating therapeutically. I often do. But the main agenda is really you want to be there to support them to achieve their health goals, their emotional goals, their mental wellness goals. Therapeutic communication shouldn't harm the client. Okay. And once again, there are rules, there are expectations, there's etiquette. There are professional bodies that can sort of impose rules about conduct on their members. So, for example, nurses and psychologists and doctors in Australia, they need to be registered. Their registration body, APRA, has its own set of standards that, for example, myself being a nurse, if I'm registered with APRA, which I am, there are certain expectations, things that I will and I won't do when I'm communicating with a client. And APRA is just one example of a professional organisation. There are many others and others that you'll have the opportunity to join. Expectations are also set by current best practice standards. Now, this is something you're going to hear about a lot. Best practice is when you look at all the current information available about, for example, drug and alcohol work. When you look at, what researchers and experts in this area are saying really works and, is a recommended way of doing things, that's where the term current best practice comes from. It means being up to date with the latest information and the latest understanding of what someone working in your field who's doing a really great job, whose skills and knowledge is really up to date, the way that they would practice, considered current best practice. So as you can imagine, that's often changing. We're getting more information. We're improving our understanding, especially in an Australian context. Something I've noticed in, say, the last 10 years, we've had a fantastic change in our understanding about how we as health professionals work with the GLBTQI community. So if you track back 10 years ago, there wasn't necessarily a lot of good information. There was a lot of misinformation. But now there's, been far more training, far more education. People are having more meaningful conversations. They're improving their own knowledge. There's less ignorance. And so what best practice looks like has changed. The standard's gotten higher, and hopefully it's going to get higher and higher and higher still, and you'll all be part of the evolution of that work. But that's an example of how the expectations have changed. And finally, once again, with therapeutic communication, the same as with professional communication, there are legal and ethical considerations. So legal considerations being, the absolute bare minimum that you have to do to not break the law. And ethical considerations are what happens when, okay, we're not breaking the law. The law only requires us to operate at this level. However, it would actually be preferable to go above and beyond what the law says we have to do. And that's when you get into what's ethically good practice. So something might be legal. You might technically be able to do it and get away with it. However, it's not really ethical. And so ethical practice is both, ideally, hopefully, we're obeying the law, and we're also lifting our practice up to a level where it's really great humanistic drug and alcohol work. So as I mentioned, drug and alcohol organisations develop their own policy and procedure documents. So that really helps AAD workers to make sure that they're practicing in a way that's legal and also ethical, and it's aligned with the organisation's own values and standards of practice. We're actually going to have the opportunity in this unit to have a look at some examples of policy and procedures, guidelines, and that'll form part of an assessment, upcoming assessment. And finally, I think this is the last slide in this section, the main steps in communication. Now, we all communicate every day. We're all adults. It might seem a bit redundant to actually go through and number the steps in communication because we all do that naturally, right? However, I think this list is really, really interesting because when breakdowns in communication happen, when misunderstandings happen, when a person gets really upset or really angry, and the person who they've been communicating with can't seem to understand why, if you go back and reflect on what happened and go through it step by step, frame by frame, you'll find that breakdowns in communication can happen at all these different stages. Each different stage represents an opportunity for something to go amiss. And the value in doing that is we can learn from when, communication doesn't go well. And also we can be mindful as we're communicating, as we're going through the different stages, even though we might go through it very, very naturally and very intuitively. We can be mindful of what's going on at each step in the process. And when we're communicating with someone who has really different communication needs to ourselves, then we can use this as a little bit of a checklist, if you will, as to, okay, at each stage in the communication process, how can I make sure that my communication is as effective as possible? So it's really, really, it's really helpful in reflective practice, which is something that hopefully all of you will embrace and be doing throughout your career, taking time away to step away from your work and reflect on how you're going as an AAD worker, what you can improve, what you're doing really well at. Tools like these can be really wonderful for you to reflect on different communication moments that you've had, and how you can really develop your skills. So this has come to the first break. You're welcome to have a break now, or you can power on through if you like. I just thought it would be cute to put in a reminder here that hunger, thirst and tiredness all impact on our communication. So, we can never communicate at our best when our bodies are just aching for a rest. And any new parents of babies who are listening to this will be nodding madly. So feel free to go and have a break. Alternately, keep powering on through. The next section is going to get a bit exciting because I'm going to explore some really common barriers to communication, where communication breakdowns occur, specifically for AOD workers. And I I can share with you that I have lots of experiences of this myself. So I'll be sharing some personal stories and anecdotes along the way. So stay tuned. Okay, I've had a sip of a cup of tea myself. I hope you're back and refreshed. Communication barriers in drug and alcohol. Let's dive in. Now, bear in mind, these are not the only barriers you'll face, but these are just some really common ones, and some that I love to draw your attention to now to really get your mind ticking and get you thinking about the importance of communication and how you can really refine and develop your communication skills. Okay. This first one here, possibly one of the most important. When I was making these slides, I considered calling this one stigma or racism or transphobia or something like that, but I actually decided to go with the title dehumanization. And the reason for that is whenever we put a label on someone and we just see that person as that label, it takes away their humanness. And we forget that beyond that label, they're just a person like us. They have the same worries, fears, dreams, hopes, the same humanity. And when we forget that, then we start behaving in really weird ways, okay? And we've all done it. It's part of being human is sometimes we dehumanize others, okay? And it's something to be aware of, know yourself and be able to check yourself and acknowledge it and then work on it, okay? It's not about, shaming and naming. It's another way to dehumanize, they're a dehumanizer, okay? It's not about that. But let's explore this a little bit. The reason that I wanted this to be front and center as a barrier to communication in the drug and alcohol sector is because people who use drugs are among the most stigmatised people that there are in the Australian Health Service. And I would further say that people who use methamphetamines or ice, they're even on another level in terms of stigmatisation. So obviously, as drug and alcohol workers, I would hope that you're people who come to this profession with a high degree of understanding and empathy that substance use has many complex reasons that sit behind it, and you're not coming here to judge. You're coming here to support and work with and really encourage and embrace people, and you're not judging their substance use. However, there are many health professionals who do, and you're going to be working with them. And amongst drug and alcohol workers, we may not dehumanise people and judge them based on their substance use, but we can dehumanise and treat them differently based on a whole heap of other reasons. So, racism is a problem in our sector. Homophobia, transphobia, we can be sexist. We might have particular attitudes or stigmas about people who have abilities other than ours. So see someone who's a user of a wheelchair and, instantly our mind sort of, reshuffles itself a bit and makes some assumptions and, pops a label on them and starts thinking and behaving differently without necessarily getting to know that person first and really coming to understand what their communication needs are. I've got here a video which I invite you to pause this recording and actually click on the link and look at that, because it's a video of a TV ad campaign. I think, it might be 4 years ago. The federal government commissioned this ad. It was all over Australia. You've probably seen it before, and it was the key message was ice destroys lives, and as a nurse, I remember the ripple of effects through the nursing community when this ad and this campaign was at its highest. And there was a huge amount of fear that if a person who's using ice, using methamphetamines, comes into your health service, you'll be assaulted. Okay, so people were going to work actually sort of, fearful for their safety, which is, it's awful. It's absolutely unacceptable. None of us should feel that way, but that's the way people were feeling. They may not have ever met a person who's used amphetamines before. They might not have ever met someone who's intoxicated and not worked with them. However, they had this, sense that, okay, if I meet someone who's been using ice, they're going to be really unpredictable. They're going to assault me. They're not going to have any control over their own actions. They're not going to have any, human values that prevent them from being violent. And this ad campaign really reinforced that fear. And so what we saw happening in hospitals and emergency departments was, a person who was suspected of using amphetamines would present. Nurses panicked. They would call security before anything had happened. Call security, get these, big burly guys, two big burly security guards in their uniform sort of standing behind the nurse before the nurse even, had gone and said hello to the person. And it created an instant sense for that patient who was coming in to seek help and support and healthcare, created an instant sense of threat. And, when someone is feeling threatened, they're feeling frightened, they're worried, these two security guards are going to hold me down and they're going to give me, an injection or something, what's going to happen? When that threat, that feeling of threat kicks in, then people are more likely to escalate their behaviour. They are more likely to, raise their voice, to shout, to they themselves become, fearful or defensive. Okay, this next slide is a really, really interesting one. Physical space and the environment that the communication is happening in. I have got lots and lots of examples where this has had either a really positive or a really negative impact on the communication between myself and an AOD client. So firstly, let's think about spaces that improve communication, and we're going to have a look at a few examples of this on the next slide. But think about the spaces where you feel comfortable, spaces that are welcoming, that are friendly, where there's tea and coffee or a cold drink, where you can sit in a comfortable chair, where just it's a nice environment, it's a pleasant environment, and you get the feeling that it's been looked after, cared for. A professional environment is also important. As an AOD client, you don't want to rock up at someone's house. You want a sense that the people who I'm seeing are professionals. They're going to, they know what they're doing. They're going to work with me in a way that's really effective. It's not, super casual. But at the same time, an environment that is friendly and is personal. It's not really clinical and impersonal. Symbols are really helpful. They really set the tone. So imagine, going back to the slide about dehumanizing, imagine clients who have experienced homophobia in a health service before, or they've experienced, it might be an Aboriginal client who has experienced racism. So walking into an environment where there is a big rainbow flag, or there's a symbol that says, okay, the staff here have put that there deliberately. That's sending an implicit message before anyone even meets or greets or anything is said. that's sending an implicit message about the values of the people who work there and the values of the organisation itself. In the same way, services that are family inclusive and have, they might have a basket of children's toys or some little low tables and chairs and that sort of thing. That environment says a child is welcome here. So a parent, who might be bringing a child to a service and thinking, oh no, what if they're loud? What if they're noisy or messy? Will I be welcome? Seeing those physical symbols of welcome for a child is going to reassure them that yes, it's okay. We expect it to be a bit noisy. We expect it to be a bit messy. That's fine. We've thought about that, and you are welcome, and your child is welcome as well. Noise and lighting levels are really important, especially think about people who might be lip reading, that the lighting has to be sufficient so that they can really, understand as much as possible. The same with noise levels. Imagine a person who is utilising a hearing aid, you don't want that horrible static sound going on for them. And where you're positioned in the room as well can make a big difference. For example, people who use hearing aids, they might find it easier to be closer to a wall. So they're sitting with their back to the wall and the person they're communicating with in front of them, rather than being like smack bang in the middle of a room with noise going on from all directions. And privacy is really important. So I'm sure we've all had the situation where we go to an emergency department and you're sitting in a bed, or your family member's sitting in a bed, and there is a curtain. There is a very, very thin curtain between you and the person next door, and you can hear everything and they can hear everything. So, we really, really, really want to consider privacy, consider who's around. If it's in a waiting room environment, being really discreet and not being friendly and welcoming people, but not, divulging personal information in front of others. And the presence of a supportive person. As AAD workers, of course, we're working with our clients, but they have people in their life who are a great strength and a great help and a great support to them. So as much as it might be comfortable and easy for us just to work one-on-one, let's think about what's comfortable and easy for the person we're working with. So that could include professionals who are there to assist them, or assist as animals as well. Being welcoming and being really understanding of the needs of the animal, but also a friend or a partner, or someone else in their life who might be important for them to be there, and really embracing that person as an important part of your effective AOD work. If you can be inclusive of them as well, it's only going to make things better for the client. Now we'll jump over to spaces that inhibit communication. So obviously, we've all been in we've all walked into a waiting room where it's sort of cold and unfriendly. We feel awkward and everyone's quiet, and that feeling when you're sitting sometimes in a doctor's waiting room and your sort of stomach feels anxious and you're nervous and nothing's happened yet. Nothing's gone wrong, but the environment itself is tense. So we want to be avoiding that. At the same time, sometimes environments like waiting rooms can be really crowded. I remember working with an organisation where the youth drug and alcohol service and the adult drug and alcohol service were located on the same premises, and they had a shared waiting room. And I was referring a 14-year-old young woman. She lived in an out-of-home care unit, so she'd been removed from her parents because they weren't able to properly take care of her. They're actually very abusive to her. She had substance use. I was referring her to get a drug and alcohol outreach worker, and the process for referring her was she needed to go to drop into this service and sit in their waiting room and wait until she could have an intake appointment. They had a specific time every afternoon, a couple of times a week, when people could drop in and get an appointment with an intake worker. And I was concerned because it was the same process for adults and young people, and I was thinking, oh, I'm concerned about this young person sitting in that waiting room with adults, and particularly, there might be people who are substance affected, or people who are a lot older than her, men who are a lot older than her, who are also waiting for support and entitled to support. It's their right to be there as well. But I was just worried about her freaking out and her feeling like, this doesn't feel safe for me. This doesn't feel like the sort of place where I will find belonging myself. And I was worried about the first impression that experience of being in the waiting room in a mixed environment might have. A beautiful thing was when I communicated these concerns to the person in charge of intake. She was really receptive, and she said, no, what we'll do is we'll actually meet with her in a cafe close by. We'll set up a special appointment specifically for her, and her worker can drop her off, can come with her, and we've got a female intake worker who will be the first person that she meets. And it's a cafe environment, so it's a friendly, it's a public space still, but you can sort of just get a table a little bit to the side so that the conversation can be a bit more private. And that can be our first meeting. From there, if we need more privacy, we can go back to the centre, but she doesn't need to be, sitting in a waiting room on her own in an environment that's not really designed for her and not developmentally appropriate. Crowded, noisy, that's pretty self-explanatory. A bulletproof screen between clients and professionals. A lot of drug and alcohol services, unfortunately, still have, the receptionist sitting behind a big screen. And I know it's all sort of changing with COVID. Now everyone has a screen for different reasons. But prior to COVID, when it wasn't the norm to have a big sort of glass or perspex screen between individuals, it can be tricky because on the one hand, a service wants to protect their staff, but also it's giving off a vibe that they're expecting violence or expecting, something to go awry. So, that can be really tricky. A frantic or chaotic atmosphere. You'll all know when you've been in an environment where sort of people are a bit on edge, it's getting a bit hectic, you yourself can start to feel a bit hectic. So even if the person is calm, they can pick up on the atmosphere and start to feel that and start to change their communication. So communication becomes a bit more frantic, a bit more reactionary. There's a higher likelihood that things might escalate and misunderstandings can occur, anger can occur. People can get upset in those sorts of environments. So there are ways that we can create an atmosphere and change an atmosphere. Restaurants, cafes, places like this are wonderful at creating a particular feel in a room. They want their customers to stay there. They want their customers to enjoy. So we can learn from that as health professionals, as drug and alcohol workers. Let's think about creating an atmosphere that's going to be really supportive of therapeutic conversations. It's going to help people to feel safe and help people to feel, that they're in good hands. The final one here, the presence of a threatening person, that's really significant. Unfortunately, it happens a bit. I gave an example earlier on of, someone who, a client, who might be approached by security guards, and especially if someone's a bit paranoid or a bit fearful or has had bad experiences before, that can be a really a really threatening presence. I love security guards. They're often great people with fantastic communication skills themselves, but the visual image of the uniform and the visual image can be threatening to many people. My example, the waiting room example just before, I think the thing that I was particularly worried about was, if someone was a bit aggressive or disgruntled or waiting too long, the impact that might have had on my young client. And an intimate partner, look, this is something you will encounter. You will encounter. It's very tricky, where you either know or you suspect that there is family violence going on, and a person comes to an AAD service with their partner. It can be incredibly challenging. Later on in the course, and this is your first day, so I'm not going to go into depth as to how to manage that. There's a lot of information, there are a lot of skills, there's a lot you can do, and you can have really successful, really therapeutic, really powerful interactions for the better. You can make a real difference. But I'm just including it here as it's something to be aware of. If you're working with someone and they feel really cagey and guarded, and you feel like they're not telling you things, and their partner is there, rather than prodding them, engaging them, trying to draw out more, you might want to take a mental note and just take their lead, and just safety is everything. Yeah, safety, your safety, their safety, the safety of everyone in the environment. So if you get a sense that someone is behaving in a protective or a guarded way, go with their lead, and of course also be notifying your manager, your team leader, get some support in, and get some support to really make sure that person is safe first and foremost. Yeah. When we come back as a group, most happy to take some questions about this, chat it through a bit more. It'll be a reoccurring, I'm so sorry to say it, but it will be something that you do have to work with in your AAD practice, and it's really important to develop skills, develop confidence, to be able to manage those sorts of situations with sensitivity, and so that everyone remains safe in that moment and also into the future as well. And here I've just got a few different visual images. I'll start, and they've all got a little bit of a story behind them. I'd be really interested to hear from you what your impression of these spaces are. They're all drug and alcohol treatment services. So the one at the top left-hand corner, that's actually based here in Melbourne. It's a drop-in centre, and you can see the symbols there. You can see we've got a beautiful coloured rainbow flag, a very loud and proud symbol about the values that are held in that space, and that the people from the LGBTQI plus community are welcome and embraced, and that it's a homophobia-free, transphobia-free zone. An interesting thing, it's a lovely environment. I've been there many, many times myself, and next to the couch, sort of on the left-hand side, there's a pool table, there's a big kitchen, massive kitchen, and in the whole space there's always these smells of sort of lasagna or, soup or something yummy cooking. That real home cooking smell is always in the air, and it's got a nice buzz to it as well. There'll often be just sort of that supportive conversation sort of buzzing that you can hear and you can feel in the atmosphere. I remember once though, a parent went and had a tour of this space, and their comments, their reflections when I was chatting to them after, said, how did you go? How was the tour? And, they'd been walked around with a lovely youth drug and alcohol worker, and, been shown the whole space. And they were fairly impressed, but they had a few concerns. One of them was at the front desk, at the reception desk, there was a big bowl of condoms. And so this parent walking in, if you think, maybe a young person, a teenager walking in would have seen the big bowl of condoms, and it's a symbol that says, we're sex positive. If you have any sexual health concerns, you can talk to us. It sends some messages to a teenager that might be very different to the messages that big bowl of condoms sends to a parent who's coming in to see the service for the first time. My cat's meowing in the background, if you can hear that. So that was the first comment that he made. And the second comment was the door to this service is a big metal door, and this service is based in Melbourne, and that industrial style of architecture where there's lots of metal, lots of sort of converted warehouse. It's got a big heavy metal front door, and he said it looked like a prison door. And I'd never thought that myself, but afterwards I reflected on and thought, yeah, it does actually look a bit like a prison. I can understand that. So it's important to, not just assume the world seen through your eyes is the same as the world seen through everyone else's eyes. The second image at the top, that's actually a headspace centre. Once again in Victoria. It's in regional Victoria though, and I included this because I love the inclusion of the guitar. This Headspace Centre it's one of my favourites in terms of the physical environment that the staff have created. There's actually, outside of the picture, there's a couple of sort of segmented chill out areas. So this is the waiting room itself, and there's a sort of area where it's right by the window. It's got lots of natural sunlight pouring in. It's got bean bags, some art materials, and a client who's going there for the first time or waiting for their appointment can sort of almost like seclude themselves a little bit in a little alcove with beautiful natural light streaming in. And just it's an environment that's really friendly and welcoming and warm, but they can also be a little bit private. They can keep to themselves if they want, if they're, someone who maybe experiences social anxiety or doesn't want to necessarily sit in a waiting room where everyone's facing one another. So it's a really lovely space that the staff have set. Now, the two photos down the bottom are both actually safe injecting rooms. The one on the left is the safe injecting room in Sydney, in King's Cross. That's been open for, I think it might be 15 years, I'm not sure, but it's been a trailblazing facility for many, many, many years. Saved I don't know how many lives. But incredible place. And the one on the right is the one that's just recently opened in Melbourne. I was fortunate enough to work there when it first opened. This picture is taken of the temporary site. So when they first opened it up, they just quickly put it into a building that was already there in Richmond, but they have since built a purpose-built facility. So it just, both services provide the same service, but the one that's more established, you can see they've just been able to add a little bit of personality to it, and you can just see the difference in the feel when staff have had enough time to be able to just create a more inviting space. So just using that as a little bit of an example of what you can do. Jumping ahead, jargon. I've got a video link. I'm not going to talk too much about this one. I'll let you watch the video. But jargon is basically what all health professionals do. We are all guilty. We have all these acronyms and the way that we speak to each other, which is like its own special language. As you learn more and more and more, you will develop more words, terminology that describes your work. Fantastic when speaking with other professionals in your team. Terrible when speaking with AOD clients. And it can be problematic even service to service. We can use different jargon. So, you might be speaking to someone who works in the justice system and they're using words that you've never heard before. And abbreviations and it just it can be incredibly confusing and you can feel really dumb asking, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about. But I really encourage you to do that. And sometimes the people who are using the jargon actually don't even know what they're saying. And so you say, I'm sorry, I've never actually heard of that before. Would you, can you explain it to me? Sometimes they'll blush and they don't know, they'll sort of backtrack a little bit. So jargon can be really helpful, but it can also be a big barrier. So be really mindful of that. And time. Now, goodness. As you enter the drug and alcohol workforce, all your best laid plans, all your hopes and dreams for your own practice, they can be so easily, assaulted by the lack of time you actually have to enact these things. It's really hard. It's an ongoing problem for all of us at all levels. It's well known. Some of the things that add to time pressure are high caseloads. So that means one worker has too many AOD clients to look after, to work with. Pressure response to waiting list. A lot of services, they can only see a certain number of AOD clients. However, the demand for that service is much higher. So you have a list of people who are waiting to have their appointment, waiting to get in. And knowing that there's a waiting list can put pressure on individual workers to need to sort of rush through more so that they can, free up spaces for the people who are on the waiting list. This is part of unrealistic targets. Once again, a target is when money is given to a service by a funding body, for example, government or a philanthropic fund or a fundraising charity. With that amount of money that the service gets, there's an agreement that they will give drug and alcohol services to a certain number of people. And often, very often, the amount of money that's given to pay for staff and pay for, the buildings and that sort of stuff doesn't match the amount of work that's expected to be done. So that creates time problems. Staffing shortages, I think you all know what that means. Funding cuts, once again, drug and alcohol services have always struggled to get enough funding from the government to be able to supply drug and alcohol support to all the people that require it. It's the same with the whole public health sector. I'm not going to get started on that on this slideshow. I'm happy to have a chat about it with anyone who wishes to afterwards. I'll just rush through a little bit. The irony, I'm on the time slide and I'm rushing through. Staff culture. This is an interesting one. There are some teams, drug and alcohol teams, who, everyone's feeling the pressure of high caseloads, the waiting lists, the unrealistic targets. There's not enough staff, someone's gone on leave, someone else is on holiday. And there can be pressure, if you're really spending a lot of time with one client, it can put pressure on your team. Okay, and so your team in turn can put pressure on you to speed things up a bit. So that's something to really be aware of. And of course, like so many professions, the demands to do things like case notes, so writing notes after each session you have with a client, or reporting, or all sorts of other duties other than just working with the clients. All that stuff eats into the time we're able to spend working with people. And so when we actually do finally get to sit down and spend time with a client, there's often we can't communicate as effectively as we'd like to, because we're aware we've got to do this, before we go home today. So there's these pressures. Finally, unequal workload and skills mix. That's not unique to drug and alcohol. Anyone who's worked in any workplace will know, that there can be unfair division of work, or the number of senior staff. There's not enough senior staff. We've got a lot of inexperienced staff, and we really need workforces where there's a mix. There's, less experienced staff bringing in new ideas, fresh eyes, fresh enthusiasm, and more experienced staff members who can provide their experience, their knowledge, and, and mentor and support. So ideally, we want a really balanced team, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And that can, add pressure. We've got 2 more slides. Confidentiality. Once again, this is a big one. We're going to go into this in a lot more depth throughout your course. But confidentiality, basically, there are laws that protect the privacy of drug and alcohol clients, or basically any person who goes to a health service. There are laws that prevent their AOD worker or their nurse or their doctor from going and talking about their private details to other people. Okay, so that's what confidentiality is. And the problem is AOD clients who don't know about these laws, they don't know that their AOD worker will keep all their information private. Of course they're going to feel worried about sharing information. Who would tell someone that they're using heroin if they thought that that person might then tell the police or tell their family, or so it's really important that we explain to AOD clients their rights. And we might need to reiterate it a few times so they really understand. There's some other complications with confidentiality, and it can impact communication in some other ways. So, of course, there's, if an AOD client doesn't realise that their information will be kept confidential, that's going to break down communication. At the same time, some workers are really scared of breaking confidentiality laws, and it prevents them from being inclusive. So there might be family members who are really supportive, who really want to be involved, and the AD client wants them to be involved as well, but the worker is scared to include them. Or perhaps there's another worker from another service. It could be a social worker from another service, or a case manager, or, housing worker. And it would be really beneficial for the AD client if these workers from these various places, they're all working together, they're all on the same page. But sometimes workers can get worried that they're going to break confidentiality laws if they do that. So it's absolutely possible to share information and still be on the right side of the law, but you have to know what you're doing and you have to do that with the consent of the client. So we'll go into more detail about that, but just to be aware that, you know, it can really cause big breakdowns of communication when it needn't. It needn't at all. Confidentiality should support our AAD work, not be a barrier to it. And our final slide, and really, really important one, is substance use can be a barrier to communication. So when people are intoxicated, their ability to communicate changes. When people are in withdrawal, that also impacts their ability to communicate. And it's not just illegal substances. It's also medications. Prescribed medications can really impact a person's ability to focus, their memory, their ability to comprehend and understand. So that's another consideration, especially when people are first starting a medication for the first time. So, for example, methadone, which is a commonly prescribed medication to people who've been using opiates. You'll encounter that quite a bit. You know, when people first start using that, it can impair their, you know, ability to communicate. They might be fine as well, but just keep that in mind, that what's going on for a person in terms of what substances they have in their system can be really impactful. There's a little video here. It's completely optional to watch it. I thought it was quite sweet, actually. I got my husband to watch it as well, and he had a good chuckle. It just runs for about 6 minutes, and the video is people answer questions about love before and after drinking alcohol. So just have a look and pay attention to not just their communication style, but what they say. It's very interesting. And I've just got a trigger warning here. This video does show people drinking alcohol. So if that's something that, so please feel free not to watch the video. It's completely optional. This actually brings me to the end of today's narrated session. Thank you all for joining me. I hope that it's stirred up in you some interest in developing your own communication skills and communication style, and also stirred up in you a real curiosity about other people's perspective on communication. Hopefully in this unit we can all learn from one another, and we can start seeing the world a little bit and hearing the world a little bit through one another's ears and eyes. And that will be a huge benefit when we're working with our drug and alcohol clients. The more perspectives we can be exposed to, then the greater capacity we'll have to work with people who are different to ourselves and really let them get the maximum out of our work with them, and really connect with them as deeply and as meaningfully as possible. So that's my hope. Any questions you have, anything that's stirred up in you that you'd like to talk about, I would love to hear from you, and you're welcome to jump back into the Canvas room. I'll be available for any one-to-one catch up and chat. Otherwise, I'll see you when our class resumes this afternoon.